The last thing I remembered was the smell of bleach and the rhythmic, mocking tick of a clock in a room with padded walls. I remembered the heavy, sluggish feeling in my limbs, the medication Hugo had insisted I needed because I was overworked and delusional. My heart had felt like a bird trapped in a cage, fluttering erratically until it simply gave up. Heart failure, they called it. A clean, clinical end for the woman who had built a culinary empire from the shadows while her husband took the bows. Then a gasp. My lungs filled not with the sterile air of the sanitarium, but with the rich, intoxicating aroma of roasted aji amarillo and sizzling garlic. I blinked, the world coming into sharp, terrifying focus. I wasn't in a white gown. I was in my stained chef's whites. In my hand, I held my favorite Santoka knife, its blade reflecting the harsh industrial lights of the kitchen at Sol de Lima. "Isabella, are you daydreaming again?" The voice sent a shiver of pure ice down my spine. I looked up to see Hugo standing at the pass, looking handsome, polished, and utterly monstrous in his crisp, white jacket. This was the night of the National Culinary Awards. I was prepping the Seco de Cordero, the dish that would win him his second Michelin star. I'm fine, I said, my voice cracking. I looked down at the knife. It was heavy real. My hands weren't shaking from the sedatives anymore. "You look pale, darling," Hugo said, stepping closer. He reached out to tuck a stray hair behind my ear, his touch making my skin crawl. "Maybe you should go upstairs and lie down. You know how your nerves get during service. I can finish the sauce." "No," I said, pulling away. The memory of the sanitarium flashed before my eyes. The way he had looked at me through the observation glass, a smile of pity on his face while he told the doctors I was losing my mind. "I'll finish it, Hugo. I want to make sure it's perfect." "You're being obsessive again, Isabella," he whispered, his voice dropping into that low, manipulative tone he used to make me doubt my own shadow. "Remember what the doctor said about your manic episodes. Don't push yourself. People are starting to notice how unstable you've been." In my past life, I would have apologized. I would have handed him the knife, retreated to the back, and let him take the credit while I wept in the pantry. But as I looked at the lamb on the cutting board, I realized I hadn't just been given my life back. I had been given the chance to let the world taste the truth. "I'm not unstable, Hugo," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "I'm focused. Now get out of my kitchen. You have guessed a charm." He stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "Your kitchen? Isabella, you're confused. This is my restaurant. You're just here to help." I didn't answer. I turned back to the stove, the heat of the fire grounding me. I knew what happened next. In 2 hours, Sebastian Larco, the man whose pen could make or break a career, would sit at table 4. In my past life, Hugo had served him my dish and claimed the recipe as his own. Not tonight. The kitchen was a symphony of chaos, but for the first time, I was the conductor, not the ghost. Hugo hovered at the edge of my station, his presence a dark cloud. Every time I reached for a spice, he was there whispering, "Are you sure you want to add that much? You're getting confused again, Bella. You're overthinking the salt." "Hugo, go check the dining room," I said, my voice like wetted stone. "I'm just worried about you," he said, loud enough for the sous chefs to hear. He put on a face of tragic concern. "You've been talking to yourself all morning. Maybe we should call Dr. Eris tonight." The sous chefs glanced at me with pity. That was his weapon, the slow, deliberate erosion of my reputation. He made everyone believe I was a fragile genius on the brink of collapse so that when he finally locked me away, it looked like an act of mercy. "I'm fine, Hugo. Focus on the wine pairings," I said, turning my back on him. I began to prep the ceviche de mercado. This wasn't the refined, soulless version Hugo wanted. This was the recipe my grandmother had taught me in the dusty streets of Pura. It was loud, vibrant, and honest. As I sliced the red onions into translucent ribbons, I felt the power returning to my fingers. The ticket machine sputtered. "Table 4. Tasting menu. 1. My heart hammered. Sebastian Larco had arrived. I watched through the porthole window of the kitchen door. Sebastian sat alone, a man with silvering hair and eyes that seemed to dissect the very atmosphere of the room. He was the only critic Hugo feared because Sebastian didn't care about the decor or the celebrity status. He cared about the soul of the food. Hugo grabbed the first plate, the ceviche, to run it out himself. "I'll handle the critic, Isabella. You just stay back here where it's quiet. We don't want you having a spell in front of him." "Wait," I said, grabbing his arm. "If you're taking my food out there, Hugo, make sure you tell him what's in the tiger's milk. He'll ask about the citrus." "I know my own recipes, Bella," Hugo snapped, shaking me off. I watched as he approached Sebastian with that practiced, oily charm. I saw Sebastian take a bite. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He closed his eyes, his brow furrowing. Then he looked up at Hugo and said something that made Hugo's smile falter. Hugo returned to the kitchen, his face flushed. He's being difficult. He wants to know why the profile has changed since the last time I described the dish to him. He asked if I had a new consultant. "Maybe he can taste that the person who cooked it actually has a pulse," I said, plating the next course. "Watch your tongue," Hugo hissed. "You're lucky I keep you around. Without me, you'd be in a ward, Bella. Don't forget who protects you." I plated the lamb, the secco, with a precision that felt like an execution. I didn't send it with Hugo. I waited until his back was turned, and then I walked out into the dining room myself. The dining room of Sol de Lima was draped in gold and velvet, a palace built on my labor. As I walked toward table 4, the hush that fell over the room was palpable. The unstable wife of the great Hugo Ruiz was out in the open. I placed the lamb in front of Sebastian Larco. "The secco de cordero," I said, my voice steady. "Slow-braised for 12 hours in fermented corned beer and fresh cilantro. I used a hint of smoked lodge squash from my family's farm." Sebastian looked at the plate, then up at me. His eyes were sharp, searching. "And who are you?" "Isabella Ruiz," I said. "The chef." Hugo was there in a second, his hand gripping my shoulder with bruising force. "My wife is having a bit of a confused night, Sebastian. Isabella, darling, you shouldn't be out here. The heat in the kitchen is getting to you." Sebastian ignored Hugo. He took a bite of the lamb. He sat in silence for a long time, the tension in the room stretching to the breaking point. "This dish," Sebastian said finally, his voice cutting through Hugo's prattle. "It has a lineage. It has a memory. It's a completely different language than the man I was just speaking to." He looked at Hugo, then back at me. "Mr. Ruiz, you told me earlier the secret was the sous vide temperature. But this was cooked in a clay pot, wasn't it?" I nodded. "It was." "Isabella, go back to the kitchen." "Now," Hugo hissed, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "Actually," Sebastian said, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin, "I'd like to speak with the chef. Alone. Hugo, I believe you have other guests to attend to." Hugo stood frozen, caught between his public persona and his private rage. He eventually forced a laugh. "Of course. She's a bit flighty, Sebastian. Don't take everything she says to heart." As Hugo retreated, Sebastian leaned in. "I've eaten Hugo's food for 5 years, Isabella. It was always technically perfect, but it was empty. Like a beautiful house with no one living inside. Tonight someone is home. Tell me, why has he been hiding you?" "Because he knows that if I leave, the house collapses," I said. "Then why are you still here?" Sebastian asked. "I won't be for long," I replied. That night, for the first time in years, I didn't go home with Hugo. I waited until the restaurant was empty, gathered my set of knives, and walked out the back door into the cool Lima night. I had no money, no home, and a husband who was already calling the police to report his mentally ill wife as a runaway. But I had my recipes, and for the first time, I had a witness. Leaving Hugo wasn't just about moving out, it was about reclaiming my mind. I spent the first week in a small, damp pension near the fish market, jumping at every shadow, half expecting Hugo to show up with 2 men in white coats. He sent flowers. Then he sent lawyers. Then he sent messages that alternated between, "I love you, please come home, you're sick," and "I will destroy you, and make sure you never hold a knife in this city again." I ignored them all. I spent my days at the market, talking to the vendors I had known for years. They didn't see an unstable woman. They saw the girl who knew how to pick the freshest corvina by the brightness of its eyes. One afternoon, a sleek black car pulled up to the market stalls. Sebastian Larco stepped out. "You're a hard woman to find, Isabella," he said, looking at the crate of limes I was inspecting. "I'm not hiding," I said. "I'm just starting over." "Hugo is telling everyone you had a nervous breakdown," Sebastian said. "He's officially closed the restaurant for a week out of respect for his wife's health. He's trying to starve you out of the industry." "He can't starve a woman who knows how to cook for herself," I said. "I've found a space. A small storefront in Bronco. It used to be a laundry." "You're going to open a restaurant? Alone? Across the street from his flagship?" Sebastian asked, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "Not a restaurant," I said. "A pop-up. 12 seats. One menu. My name on the door." "You'll need a review," Sebastian said. "No," I replied, looking him in the eye. "I'll need a fair tasting. Don't write a word until you eat my food without his shadow over the plate." "Deal," Sebastian said. I spent the next 2 weeks scrubbing floors and painting walls. I called my restaurant races Roots. I didn't have Michelin star linens or gold-plated silverware. I had wooden tables, mismatched plates, and the smell of home. The night before I opened, Hugo appeared at the door. He didn't look like the charming chef now. He looked haggard, his eyes wild. "You think you're a chef?" he laughed, his voice echoing in the empty room. "You're a cook, Isabella. You're a laborer. Without my branding, without my face, you're nothing. Close the circus down and come home. I'll tell the doctors it was a temporary lapse. I can still save you." "Save yourself, Hugo," I said, holding the door open. "Because tomorrow, everyone is going to find out that the great Hugo Ruiz can't even boil an egg without his unstable wife to hold his hand." Opening night at Races was silent. No press, no celebrities, no Hugo. Just the sound of my knife hitting the board and the sizzle of the pan. The first guest to walk in was an old woman from the market. She sat down looking confused. "Is this the place that smells like my mother's kitchen?" "It is," I said. I served her lomo saltado. It was simple, but I used the technique of the high-flame wok, a searing heat that locked in the juices of the beef and the sweetness of the onions. By the end of the first hour, the 12 seats were full. People had heard the rumors, but they stayed for the flavor. They realized that the food they had been paying hundreds of dollars for at Sol de Lima was here, in a converted laundry, served by a woman who looked exhausted but alive. Sebastian Larco arrived at 9 p.m. He sat at the counter, watching me work. I didn't say a word. I just cooked. I served him causa alemana, mashed yellow potatoes seasoned with lime and chili, layered with fresh crab. "Hugo is across the street right now," Sebastian said between bites. "He's throwing a reopening gala. Half the critics in the city are there. But the dining room is half empty. Word is traveling, Isabella." "I don't care about his dining room," I said. "I care about this plate." "The difference," Sebastian said, pointing to the causa, "is that you can taste the respect for the ingredient. Hugo always tried to hide the potato behind truffles and gold leaf. You let the potato be a hero." He stayed until I closed. As I was wiping down the counter, he reached out and took my hand. It was the first time someone had touched me with respect, not as a possession or a patient. "You're going to be the face of this cuisine, Isabella," he said softly. "And I want to be the one to tell the world why." "I don't need a hero, Sebastian," I said. "I know," he smiled. "You need a partner. And maybe someone to help with the wine list." The war didn't start with a shout. It started with a whisper, then a whistle, then the sharp, clinical rap of a clipboard against my door. Races had been open for only a month, and the narrow street in Barranco was already clogged every night with Blacktown cars and foodies shivering in the evening mist just for a taste of my lomo saltado. I was no longer a ghost. I was a phenomenon. And for a man like Hugo, who fed on attention like a parasite, my success was a lethal poison. "Health inspection," the man said, his face a mask of bureaucratic indifference. It was Tuesday, 6 p.m., exactly when my prep was at its most critical.
He was the third one that week.
First, it was a noise complaint in a neighborhood known for its late-night bars. Then, a surprise audit of my meager books.
Now this.
I watched him poke through my dry storage, his gloved fingers searching for a speck of dust that didn't exist. I knew who sent him. Hugo was using every connection, every silver-tongued lie, and every centivar, his fortune to smother my flame before it burned his house down. "You won't find anything," I said, my voice calm as I continued to emulsify a batch of yellow chili paste. "My kitchen is cleaner than your conscience, and definitely cleaner than the one across the street." He didn't answer, but as he left, empty-handed and frustrated, I saw the black SUV idling at the corner. Hugo was inside, watching. He was trying to starve me out. He had threatened my fishmonger, Donna Maria, telling her he'd pull his massive account if she sold me so much as a single clam. But Hugo forgot one thing. I was the one who had attended the dawn markets with these vendors for a decade while he was sleeping off his wine. "Don't worry, Majida," Donna Maria had whispered that morning, slipping me the best of the morning's catch under a crate of ice. "He has the money, but you have the respect. He can't buy what you earned in the trenches." The breaking point came on a humid Thursday. The dining room was packed, the air thick with the scent of searing beef and charred onions. Sebastian was in his usual corner, his notebook closed, simply watching me plate a delicate chicha morada sorbet. Suddenly, the front door didn't just open. It slammed. Hugo stumbled in, smelling of expensive bourbon and cheap desperation. His chef's whites, once his suit of armor, were stained with wine and sweat. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. "You think this is food?" he roared, his voice cracking as he pointed a trembling finger at a guest's plate. "This is peasant trash. I made you, Isabella. I took a girl from the mountains and gave her a name. You're nothing but a manic, unstable cook who wouldn't know a Michelin star if it hit her in the face." The dining room went silent. The clatter of forks stopped. I stepped out from behind the counter, wiped my hands on my apron, and stood my ground. In my past life, I would have trembled. I would have looked for a place to hide. But now, looking at him, I didn't see a master. I saw a scared, mediocre man whose mask had finally slipped. "I'm not the one shouting in a crowded room, Hugo," I said, my voice low and steady, carrying into every corner of the silence. "I'm the one who's cooking. You're the one who's haunting a restaurant that's already dead. You didn't make me. You used me. And the world can finally taste the difference." "You're sick," he screamed, lunging toward me. "You're delusional. I'll have you committed again. I'll—" He never finished. Sebastian stood up, his presence massive and immovable as he stepped between us. Two of my regulars, brothers who worked construction, were on their feet in a second, pinning Hugo's arms behind his back. "The only thing being committed tonight, Hugo, is a police report for assault," Sebastian said, his eyes like flint. As the police let a sobbing, incoherent Hugo out into the night, I didn't feel the triumph I expected. I felt a profound, quiet peace. I looked at my guests, my witnesses, and then at the stove. "I'm sorry for the interruption," I said to the room. "The next round of drinks is on the house. Now, who's ready for dessert?" The applause that followed was the only review I ever truly needed. The morning the review hit the stands, I didn't even have the courage to buy a copy. I stayed in the back of the laundry-turned-kitchen, obsessively scrubbing the same stainless steel prep table until it shone like a mirror. My hands, which had sliced through thousands of onions and filleted countless fish without a tremor, were shaking. This wasn't just about a grade. This was the verdict on my sanity. If the world didn't believe the food, they'd believe Hugo's lies. They'd think I was just a troubled woman who got lucky for a night. The bell above the door chimed, a sharp, cheerful sound that made me jump. I looked up to see Sebastian. He wasn't wearing his usual critic scowl or his professional mask. He was carrying a bundle of newspapers under one arm and a single, deep red rose in the other. He looked at me, and for a second, he didn't say anything. He just stood there, the sunlight from the street catching the silver in his hair. "You should read this, Isabella," he said, his voice unusually soft. He laid the paper on the counter, the headline staring back at me in bold, black ink. The Queen in the Laundry, Why Isabella Ruiz is the True Heart of Peru. I felt a lump form in my throat as my eyes scanned the columns. Sebastian hadn't just written about the acidity of my limes or the tenderness of my lamb. He had written about the silence. He wrote, "For years, we were fed a lie plated in gold leaf. We were told that greatness looked like Hugo Ruiz, while the true architect of our national palate was being methodically erased, gaslit into believing her own genius was a symptom of madness." "You told them," I whispered, my voice thick with tears. "You told them everything." "I told them the truth, Isabella," he said, stepping around the counter. He reached out, his hand hovering near mine before he gently took the cleaning rag from my grip. "The industry is in an uproar. Sol de Lima didn't even open for lunch today. The staff walked out. They said they wouldn't work for a thief who stole from his own wife." Is Hugo there?" I asked. "Hugo is gone," Sebastian said. "He was seen at the airport this morning. Rumor has it he's fleeing to Spain to avoid the fraud investigations. The bank froze the restaurant's accounts. It's over, Isabella. The palace has crumbled." I sank onto a stool, the weight of the last 2 lives finally crashing down on me. I thought of the padded room, the smell of bleach, and the way Hugo had whispered that I was nothing into my ear while the doctors watched. I realized then that I wasn't waiting for him to apologize. I was waiting for the world to stop looking at me through his eyes. "The pop-up is over, too," Sebastian said, breaking the silence. I looked up, a flash of fear piercing my chest.
"What?"
"But I just started. I have reservations through next month." "You've outgrown 12 seats and a converted laundry," he smiled, and for the first time, it was a warm, brilliant thing. He leaned against the prep table, looking at me with an intensity that made my heart race for a very different reason. "I've spent the morning fielding calls from investors who want to give you the flagship space in Miraflores. The one with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the garden terrace. They want you to build something that belongs only to you." "I don't know if I'm ready for that," I said, looking at my scarred, hard-working hands. "You were ready the moment you picked up that knife and didn't let him take it," Sebastian said. He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering for a moment against my skin. "I'm not just a critic anymore, Isabella. I want to be the one who handles the business, the wine, the noise, so you can just be the chef. No more shadows. No more ghosts. You do that for me?" I asked. "I do it for the woman who changed the way I taste the world," he replied. I looked around my small, humble kitchen. It was time to move on. The unstable wife was dead, and the chef was finally taking her place at the pass. 5 years. In the culinary world, 5 years is an eternity. Long enough for a dozen trends to rise and fall, for empires to crumble, and for a name to be forgotten. But standing at the pass of my restaurant, Isabella, I felt like I was only just beginning to plate the main course of my life. The kitchen was nothing like the cramped, dark theater of shadows I had shared with Hugo. It was an open cathedral of light in the heart of Miraflores, with floor-to-ceiling glass that allowed the guests to see every flick of the wrist and every flame of the wok. There were no secrets here. No one was hidden. Every chef on my line was a partner, not a servant. "Chef, the marrow murike is ready for inspection," my lead sous chef said, presenting a plate with the pride of a woman who knew her worth. I looked at the dish. It was beautiful, a piece of perfectly seared fish resting in a vibrant broth of fermented corn and mountain herbs, garnished with edible flowers from our own rooftop garden. It didn't need gold leaf or truffles to be expensive. It was expensive because it was honest. "It's perfect, Sophia," I said, sliding the plate onto the warming rack. "Run it." I looked out into the dining room. It was a sea of black ties and silk dresses, but the atmosphere was warm, filled with the hum of genuine laughter rather than the stiff, practiced social climbing that had defined Sol de Lima. At the center of it all sat Sebastian. He wasn't at a critic's table tonight. He was at a small table near the kitchen, a glass of dark red wine in his hand, and a look of quiet contentment on his face. He had retired from the world of reviews the day we got married. He said he couldn't objectively judge a world when he had already found the only flavor that mattered. Now, he was the backbone of my business, the man who navigated the contracts, the investors, and the noise so that I could simply be the architect of taste. He caught my eye and raised his glass. I felt a flush of heat that had nothing to do with the stove. "Closing in 10 minutes, chef," Sophia whispered with a playful smirk. "I think your favorite regular is getting impatient." I laughed, wiped my hands on my apron, and stepped out from behind the counter. As I walked toward Sebastian, I passed a young girl at a corner table. She couldn't have been more than 20, her eyes wide as she watched the kitchen. She was one of the students from the foundation I had started, a scholarship program for young women from the provinces. "Chef Isabella," she whispered as I passed. "I want to be just like you."
I stopped and took her hand.
It was a small gesture, but it felt like closing a circle. "No," I told her. "You're going to be better. Because you're going to keep your own name on the menu from day one." I reached Sebastian's table, and he stood to pull out my chair. "You look tired, Bella," he said, his voice a low, warm caress. He reached across the table and took my hand, his thumb tracing the faint scar on my palm from a knife slip years ago. "But you look like you're finally home." "I am," I said, leaning back into the soft velvet of the chair. "I was just thinking about the woman in that hospital room. The one who thought her heart had failed." Sebastian squeezed my hand, his eyes dark with a protective, fierce love. "Her heart didn't fail, Isabella. It was just waiting for the right ingredients to start beating again." "I think the recipe is finally finished," I said, smiling as the waiter brought us 2 small bowls of the purple corn sorbet. "Not finished," Sebastian corrected, lifting his spoon. "Just perfected." As the last of the lights dimmed in the dining room and the city of Lima hummed outside our windows, I realized that the rebirth wasn't a magic trick. It was the slow, steady work of a woman who refused to stay a ghost. My name was Isabella Ruiz. I was a survivor, a wife, and a mentor. But most of all, I was the one who held the knife. And this time, I was the one who decided